Welcome to the RFBerlin Forum on Migration. My name is Tim Phillips. A group of researchers are meeting here in Germany's capital to discuss their research on this important and contentious topic, and I'm here to talk to some of those experts. When politicians speak about immigration, one word tends to dominate.
Secure our borders.
To secure our borders.
Securing our borders.
Securing our borders.
Securing America's borders.
Yes, security. So how effective are the efforts to secure Europe's borders? And are they proportional to the problem? What will it take to convince the public that our borders are secure? And is the focus on irregular migration poisoning the debate on the positive stories of immigration? I spoke to Christian Dustmann, director of RFBerlin, who has been following and writing about this debate for his entire career, and Tommaso Frattini of the University of Milan, who is also co-director of the Global Migration Research Hub at RFBerlin. Tommaso has also just published a paper that examines how immigration enforcement works along Europe's extended border. Christian, I would say welcome, but we're in your house, really. So thank you for having me.
Well, welcome to you.
And Tommaso as well.
Hi, Tim.
We're talking about crossing the external border into Europe. This language of securing our external borders, you're hearing it more and more from politicians now. Why is it such a political hot potato?
Because it is, of course, a very sensitive issue. It undermines, to some extent, the feelings of security of European citizens who understandably want to make sure that they have safety, that their place, the place where they live, is secure and is looked after. And therefore, it is easy to actually look at people who try and come into Europe as those who can put at risk the livelihood and the way of life that European citizens normally have. So for this very reason, and for this very legitimate reason, actually, the issue of irregular migration and the narrative of massive flows pushing at European borders is easy to be captured by politicians for political gains, for political advantage.
I think there are two types of migration at the moment. The one type are the economic migrations, and the other type are migrations which to some extent are related to the 1951 Geneva Convention. People who cross borders without legal documents, but then apply for refugee status in one form or another. This former type of migration, in terms of numbers, is far more massive. We have seen, after the Great Recession, an 80% increase in the share of foreign nationals on the German workforce. In the case of the UK, things are even more extreme. In 2023, 2024, net migration went up absolutely dramatically. I think in 2024, we were close to 800,000. Nobody really talked about that. But what the debate was about was the 34,000. That's not even 5% on the net migration number we have seen more or less legally entering the country, the 34,000 coming over from Calais to the British mainland. So that was the Rwanda debate. That was the debate which was taken up by the, former Brexit, now Reform Party. That was the debate which basically went through the Conservative Party and also influenced the Labour Party in the way they were designing policies towards migration. And I think similar developments we see in basically all European countries, where the focus is on a type of migration which in terms of numbers is relatively modest. However, it is ticking certain boxes of instinctive feelings which are then relentlessly exploited by particular political movements.
It is also true that in recent years, the number of irregular migration attempts into Europe have gone up with respect to, say, 10 years ago. The numbers fluctuate a lot over time, but the numbers are in recent years consistently higher than what we were used to until early 2000s, say.
What sort of scale of increase are we talking about?
So we're talking about 240,000 irregular border crossing attempts in 2024, which is actually a decline, a 38% decline with respect to 2023, where we had the 380,000 crossings. That was a peak that was reached only in 2015 during the so-called refugee crisis. In earlier years, numbers were much lower. But as you can see, even from one year to another, there's a huge fluctuations.
What has changed over the last 10 years is not just that we have more border crossings, but what also has changed is that migration has become much more important in the policy debate. And at the same time, we saw a dramatic polarization of our political spectra. So nearly each European country has now a populist, right-leaning party, although some of the migration resistance issues are also to be found on the very left of the political spectrum. What these parties are discussing is not the economic or fiscal benefit of migration. What it is something which appeals much more to our instincts, and it's much less accessible to rational argument, and that is security, crime, issues which have to do with our instincts. Tommaso pointed out last year we had about 240,000 illegal border crossings into the EU. Now, that number is dwarfed by legal migration on other routes for economic reasons. Yeah, so many more people come to EU countries legally to actually work. And many countries, like for instance Germany, need these migrants because of dramatic demographic changes. If we look at the period after the Great Recession, we had a dramatic downturn in the active labor force of individuals born in the country, which was compensated by very large migrations. And we will see that also in future. So that immediately creates a policy dilemma. So on the one hand, we have large parts of the population who is uncomfortable with migration. On the other hand, industry and our economies ask our politicians to make workers available for many sectors where we have skill demands which we can't cover with our home workforces.
For people who don't live in Europe, who aren't familiar with the Schengen Agreement, for example, the external border to Europe really is the frontier that matters.
The fact that we have Schengen agreements that have essentially removed internal borders within the EU mean that what really matters for the European population is what happens at the EU external borders. So it's the countries that are at the external borders of the EU who are in charge, if you want, or securing the European borders. So there's an increasing emphasis in policy making on this specific dimension of migration policy. This is partly driven by exogenous factors, conflicts, humanitarian crises that go on outside of Europe, but partly this is also policy driven, and it's driven by the fact it is effectively very, very difficult to enter Europe legally for economic reasons. So basically, if you want to enter Europe, your best chances are either to have a family member in Europe and being able to meet the requirement to join your family member, because that's also becoming increasingly difficult, or to come to Europe irregularly and possibly apply for asylum once you are here, even though you may not be a legitimate asylum seeker.
So given how politically salient this debate is, and given that it is in the mutual interest of all the states within the EU to secure their external borders, how well do EU states cooperate to do this at the moment? How do they cooperate to do it?
I think big mistakes have been made. So clearly, as Tommaso pointed out, the numbers of what we may call illegal crossings into the European Union have gone up, and they vastly fluctuate with conflicts which are out of the remit of the European Union. But at the same time, we, in particular in Northern Europe or Scandinavia, were actually very reluctant to support those countries who are at the exterior borders of Europe to do something about it. And I think the political pressure, many parties also in the north, in the center of the political spectrum, are seeing themselves right now, has actually, led to some pretty dramatic legislative attempts. We have missed, I think, many opportunities to prevent a situation as the one we are seeing at the moment by acting supportively for the border countries of Europe a little bit earlier.
While it is in common interest to protect, if you want to use this word, which I don't like too much, but like to secure, to make sure that there's some enforcement at our external borders. On the other hand, of course, the issue is more salient for some countries than for others. So unlike other countries like the US, where you have a large border with Mexico, but every point you cross the border, it's always going to lead you into the US. In Europe, the situation is different because if people cross from Morocco to Spain, then this is going to become an issue that Spain has to deal with. And this, as we have studied in our paper, leads to a situation where different countries have incentives to exert more effort to control the borders on the routes that directly affects them. And this is maybe optimal from the single country point of view, but it may not be optimal from the EU perspective as a whole. Because from the point of view of Italy, what may matter is that there's less migratory pressure on Italy. And if this comes at the cost of increasing migratory pressure on Spain and on Greece, then from Italian politicians or from Italian even population point of view, that may be fine. But from the EU perspective as a whole, there's no gain, basically, if you just move people around.
So would it take the political heat out of this debate? And I think this might be what's behind the research, your research that you've done, if there was increased coordination and people had the idea that illegal migration was under control.
So the key point here is that people have to feel that the situation is under control. And that is, of course, a very legitimate concern. It touches at the core, at the heart of people's attitudes, right? So you want to make sure that you're safe. So that's why people are particularly sensitive to even isolated episodes, whereas they miss the broader picture because they're not directly touched by that. People need security. But the risk is that by focusing so much on border controls, this increases the saliency of an issue which may be not as prominent as it actually is felt by most of the population.
Yes, I would slightly disagree with that. I kind of feel quite comfortable that many governments in Europe are continuing to run their labor market-oriented migration policies in quite a rational way. So they respond to skill shortages, they hear industry, they hear employers. Violating borders is always felt as a threat. So the focus is on this debate. And I think to some extent politicians may actually play that. It is always a very thin line politics has to walk. We fight, so to say, illegal border crossings. We are seen to be active. We are seen to do something. On the other hand, we quietly allow for economic migration, which is, welfare enhancing for our economies. I think that's the tendency we are seeing at the moment.
Also, I agree with you that these two issues have to be balanced, but it seems to me that there is an excessive emphasis on securing borders and not so much on legal pathways of migration. So it is, I think, a fact that there is an oversupply of potential migrants that are not let in, and they could be let in, and there will be labor demand to absorb them, but we artificially restrict these economic flows to cater for the fears of the resident population that otherwise migration may spiral out of control.
Tommaso, I want to talk to you about your research because it is about these fears. Your research is about looking at irregular migration over the EU as a whole. People have done it for individual routes, but you're looking at it as a whole. One of the sticks that people who would criticize the EU use to beat EU decision-making with is, they say, countries act in their own narrow interests, whether they are political or economic, and they do not coordinate over things that demand coordination. This is really behind what you've been researching.
Yeah, so what we are doing is we are studying the effect of border enforcement policies at the European external borders on the size and direction of irregular migration flows. And so what we want to try in the study is whether these border enforcement efforts are indeed successful or not. The problem when we want to study that is that, of course, we would always observe a positive correlation between the amount of border enforcement efforts that's exerted on a migratory route and the number of crossings on that route, precisely because there will be more enforcement to routes where there is more migratory pressure, right? So our problem as researchers is to find something that moves the amount of border enforcement efforts and that is not correlated with the actual migratory pressure. So what we show in our paper is that one such determinant is driven by political considerations. Routes that are closer to the country that is holding the presidency of the Council of the European Union receive, everything else equal, more border enforcement operations than other routes. Okay, so countries try and push more border enforcement efforts on the routes that matter for them. This does not mean that this is the primary driver of border enforcement efforts, but certainly we do observe that there is more attention to the tracts of the border that matter most for countries who can have some power to influence the decision of where to deploy border enforcement operations.
And I think that's exactly the point you raised before, Tim. The big difference between the US and Europe is that we have many borders, and all these borders belong to different nation states. So to coordinate migration policy is endlessly more complicated in Europe because every country has different interests. So that's why I think the legislative attempts we have seen actually turning into success very recently to create legislation on EU level are really, really very important. And what we do need is much more effort going in that direction. And I very much hope we will actually see that in the near future.
Because this technique that you've used, this is so that statistically you can identify whether these increased efforts are preventing irregular migration or just pushing it down a different route.
Yeah, so that actually allows us to show that if you exert more effort in patrolling a certain part of the border, that actually does decrease the number of crossings, of irregular border crossings on that specific part of the border. However, then the question is whether these crossings just don't happen, so if there's less migrants overall, or whether crossings just happen somewhere else. And that's, of course, hard to establish from a statistical and econometric point of view. But what our paper shows is that, at least to some extent, this diversion effect happens. So once you stop people from coming in from one way, they will take another route, another migratory route, and will try and enter from somewhere else. The amount of resources, financial and non-financial resources that have been devoted to border enforcement operations by Europe over the last years, at least part of that could have been better spent. So you can make people feel safer by having better integrated foreign population, by strengthening the safety net in general for those who can be directly harmed from an economic point of view by immigration, by having policies that help immigrants integrate and thus become effectively indistinguishable from the earlier residents of a country. And that would also help possibly alleviating concerns about migration in perhaps most cost-effective way than increasing the budget devoted to securing borders.
The big question is, of course, whether that would relieve the pressure on our external borders. And that's something I really doubt. I mean, the disparities and the increase in disparities in terms of economic possibilities, but also security, we are seeing across the world, and in particular between Europe and the Middle East on the one hand and Africa on the other hand, is dramatically increasing over the next years. And so I would think that this problem is becoming much more important and much more threatening for Europe and the centrist policies we have been used to over the last decades, and will have to be addressed by increasing coordination across European countries.
If we have to change that policy mix or the way in which those policies are presented, what will work, do you think? What has the best chance of getting the maximum possible benefit to Europe from migration whilst diffusing this political bomb that we have at the moment?
That is, of course, a very complicated question, and I'm not sure I have the silver bullet.
Yes, in 30 seconds.
But if I may, so what we are doing, we as Europe are doing increasingly, is to externalize our border controls to transit countries. Most of these transit countries are countries that have autocratic regimes that are not entirely reliable. We're transferring them an increasing amount of resources. So we are transferring 11.5 billion euros to Turkey to keep basically Syrians into Turkey. We have signed deals with the Tunisian governments, with the 2 Libyan governments that currently exist. We are striking deals with all governments, giving them not only resources, but also giving them diplomatic recognition and putting essentially the security of our borders in the hands of other countries who gain a lot of power over our external borders and sometimes also want to use this power, right? So this is also something that is concerning. This might also be a short-term solution, but it's not a permanent solution. I'm afraid I don't have a permanent solution, but I think a mix of opening regular migration routes while securing the borders, a balance between these two needs must be found.
Of course, the long-term solution would be nobody has to flee persecution, economic dismay, or insecurity. So that would mean we help those countries where many of those who claim refugee status come from. We help those countries to improve their economic and political institutions and make it worthwhile for people to actually live there. But of course, that is, I would think, a very long-term undertaking. And the tragedy is actually that many political actors are engaged in those continents which border Europe, who have very different agendas than helping Europe to cut down the flow of immigrants. Mm-hmm. Now, I think the arrangements, and I hate to say that, but I think there is a balance here between further political polarization and increases in vote shares of parties like the AfD in Germany, while continuing to protect Europe's borders, not just within Europe, but also by supporting sometimes autocratic regimes to cut down the flow of individuals who will come to Europe. Because otherwise, we had elections in Germany, the AfD, a very right-leaning party, who, if in political responsibility, would cut down migration completely, had close to 20% of the vote share. And we see similar developments in other countries. So if we don't respond to the concerns of a large part of our populations about security and about border security, even when we only talk about a relatively small number of people who actually cross into Europe, we continue to feed those political movements. And I think that would be very, very dangerous for our structures we have built up and our institutions we have built up in Europe. Choices will have to be made here, and I'm happy that I am not a politician who actually has to make these choices. So RFBerlin is having a large agenda on these. We have other projects, African migration, for instance, trying to understand the choices of individuals when they start to the destination and what happens in these, I think, on average 1 to 2 years of travel. Projects on refugee migration. More generally, we have projects on economic migrations. And I think everybody who is interested in that may want to look at the GMIH website. We have an interactive website which allows the user to basically learn anything about migration you ever wanted to know. And we also have descriptions and output about our research projects on our website. So please visit our website and make yourself familiar with our research agendas.
Yeah, we've spoken about a lot today, but we've barely scratched the surface, haven't we? Christian, Tommaso, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim.
Tommaso's paper is called Border Policies and Unauthorized Flows, Evidence from the Refugee Crisis in Europe. And the authors, Francesca Fassani and Tommaso Frattini.
Thanks for listening. The Rockwell Foundation Berlin Institute for the Economy and the Future of Work is providing new knowledge to inform public debate and to create the best possible basis for policy making. Find out more at rfberlin.com.